Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii Muniz.
Burnout. That's what we're talking about today. I have had so many students that I've talked to in the last week or two where they're coming to me and saying things like, I was doing really well, with all my practice tests, but then this week my scores plummeted and my test is next week and I don't know what to do. And how do I deal with this? And this is a really common thing. Just heads up. This is something we definitely talk about in the course, but a lot of times as tests approach for students, they tend to push a little bit harder. And so, in the last couple of weeks, students are working their hardest and they're, studying during meals and staying up late to study and waking up at 5 to study. And that is going to lead to burnout. And so today we're going to kind of take a second to step back and talk about big picture, right? Like stress, managing your motivation, how to prevent burnout, ways to make it so that you can be successful, not just on the MCAT. Yes, that is important, but also in medical school, because it turns out that this is not the last time somebody's going to be running into a stressful academic task in this pathway.
I feel a little came for, Phil. with that 5 a.m. I don't think I had actually told you this, but I had been trying to wake up at 5 a.m. before on the weekends to study. It didn't go well. So I feel a little came for with that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. So many students are coming now and they're concerned, right? And they're just like, oh my gosh, my test day is coming up. What happened? Help me understand what happened. And I find that it's usually one of two things, either a change in their strategy or burning out, or a combination of the two, honestly. Mm-hmm. And so, like you said, this isn't the last time that students are going to be seeing this. It's med school. It is med school in micro form. And so this is such a great opportunity. And I think that's what people students often don't realize, is that it's really an opportunity to prepare yourself for success for the next couple of years. And the MCAT is one of those things where we've definitely talked about this. It's a mile wide, an inch deep, so to speak. Right. And so there's so much to cover. And so it's so easy to freak out about how much you have to cover, or feeling like, that week before test day, I have to learn everything I haven't learned up until this point. If you have not mastered, right, a complex topic before this last week, you probably will not master that complex topic, right? Now, on the other hand, if, you need to brush up on amino acids, brush up on amino acids, but don't spend, 5 hours trying to master a topic that's low yield that you haven't mastered up until this point. That is the fastest way to burn out and to, set yourself up for more difficulty in the future as well. Because in medical school, you're going to have constant exams. And I think that's what people get concerned about. They're just like, the exams don't end, or I have to know so much so quickly. And the reality is there are steps that you can take to reduce the chance of you burning out that will also improve not just in the moment how you will test, but also how well you'll retain things, how well you'll actually be able to apply, how, mentally agile you'll be with those different topics and that content. And this is really a boot camp for what you'll be doing. And so it's a really great opportunity. And it sounds awful to hear that. But I wish someone would have told me that. I wish someone would have, said, okay, this is not a fun experience, but it will prepare you if you do it right, if you do it well, for what's coming next. And there are still things that, we've both been teaching this for a couple of years, but you have some more years under your belt. But there are things that even now, I've been talking with students about, and I still have to consciously remind myself as a student, as a med student, okay, don't do this. You know what you need to be doing. Let's make sure you're actually doing what you need to be doing, or not doing what you shouldn't be doing. And it's this kind of lifelong process. And I think the more we reinforce those positive approaches, the more likely we are to succeed. And that just goes through, right? I could go on and on about this for some time.
I know. And this is something that I feel like students are kind of set up for failure in a little bit of how the education system is designed. I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit. I have some very strong feelings about how the education system should change. But in undergrad, you are rewarded for sprints, right? like my test is on Friday. I'm going to start studying hardcore on Tuesday, and I'm going to push real hard. And then I take my test and then I do well. And that's fine. Right. And like that is absolutely a way to be a very successful undergrad student. Speaking as somebody who did sprints, like in undergrad, that's all I did. Like in terms of like learning and education. And the thing is, those like learning in that way, information does not stick with you very long. And so I feel like I had to re-memorize my amino acids a dozen times because I was studying in such a way that it worked for sprints. And so because it worked for all of my education career up to this point, all of a sudden the MCAT and medical school change. And now you are not getting rewarded for how quickly can you cram a bunch of information in and then forget it a week later. You're being like, the exams are, you need to study today for a test months from now, right? Like that's not normal in undergrad. That's not normal in high school and middle school. That's not normal in an educational career up until this point. But if you think about it, like that's how med school has to be, right? Like you don't want your doctor to be somebody who memorized a bunch of stuff and then forgot it all. And now they're your doctor, right? Like that doesn't work. And so that's why, you know, as I know we've talked about this a lot. That's why like I really like seeing the MCAT as boot camp, because med school is this marathon type of studying rather than sprints. And the MCAT is marathon type of studying. And so making it through the MCAT makes you a better medical student, but it means that you have to relearn how to study, relearn how to approach things. And that's painful, right? It's really painful to be like starting from zero. And like, the thing is, once you've gotten to this point where you're taking the MCAT, you have learned a lot of ways to deal with learning, right? Like education, you've been in the system for a while. It's really uncomfortable and obnoxious to be in this scenario where like I have been educating myself solidly for almost 2 decades. And now all the things I learned and the tools I had don't work anymore. And like, that's a really painful thing to go through. But I really liked how you said that like cramming that like week before the test like is not gonna work out. That's also how marathons are, right? Yeah. Like speaking as somebody who's not ever ran a marathon, all the prep for running a marathon is not done the week of the marathon, right? Like it's done months, like years before this. And then that week before you actually run that first marathon, that's your easiest week because you need to make sure that you're in shape for the marathon. Same thing for the MCAT. The hardest part of the MCAT and like prepping for the MCAT is the months before the MCAT. The week of your actual MCAT should be the easiest week that you have had in months. But that's something that is just a little bit tricky and different. And like I said, opposite of how at least my undergrad experience was.
Yeah. And I think this is not, I know we weren't planning on talking about this, but the way that you're approaching that last week can actually be an indicator if you need to push your exam or not. Because if you're sitting down and you're like, holy cow, there are all these lists of high yield topics that I have no idea what's going on, right? Or, you know, I have consistently not been where I need to be, and my scores are consistently lower than my goal. And now I feel the need to cram all. That's part of why I feel the need to cram so much into this last week. That's the moment to say, wait a second, hold up. Taking stock, I might actually benefit from pushing my exam back. Right. And that's also something that is really uncomfortable, but that, you know, you will have to decide to do. And that, again, that applies to the MCAT, that applies to exams in medical school. Granted, there are some exams you can't push back, right? You know, if you're in a class, you can't push those exams, but there are others that you can, and that you need to have that self-awareness to know, why am I feeling this need to push so intensely? Is it the kind of normal response because test day is coming up, or is it something representing, you know, a bigger issue here? And like you said, the education system in the US is just not set up for success for most students. And so we also, like you said, have to learn to unlearn a lot of the ways that we learn, that kind of thinking about how we think, learning about how we learn. And it really comes down to, okay, how am I going to take what I have to do and make it more manageable, right? And so one of the things that I like to do is I like to change how I approach the material. But before we think about how we change our approach to the material, we have to think about the vehicle that we use to understand that material, right? We need to come back to the basics and be like, okay, how do we take care of ourselves in this? And then we can think about, okay, how am I going to approach my actual studying?
Yeah, there's so much in here that is tied to making study plans. We're not going to go real deep into making a study plan today, but that is something we're going to do in a podcast soon, because there's a lot of stuff tied in here. But just to kind of like touch for just a moment on this, like the bulk of your hardcore studying you shouldn't even really be doing that the month before your exam. The month before your exam, you should be fine-tuning. You should be working on endurance, not knowledge. You should be working on stamina, right? And maybe timing a little bit. But you shouldn't be like coming in saying like, hey, I haven't looked at the kidneys at all, and I don't know what an electron is, and I don't know anything about endocrinology. Like if that's the point where you're at like a month before your test, then you are setting yourself up to be in that place where you're having to do sprints, and that is not going to work. And so, like I said, we're going to talk more about study plans more in the future, but we want to kind of talk about this just like burnout thing, because like we said, it's something that we see all the time. And I know, Azaii, speaking as somebody who is in med school, this isn't something that stops with the MCAT. There are a lot of people that I know. There's me, myself, who burned out quite a bit in med school, and just learning how to deal with that. And I feel like a lot of the things I learned were from watching other people be more successful than I was, even though I was working harder. And that's also something that is hard to learn, talking about the education system. I feel like in high school, if you try really hard, you're going to do well. And the harder you try, the better you do. But like all of a sudden with the MCAT and med school, it's possible to be trying too hard, where you are pushing yourself and now you're doing worse because you're going too hard. And I know that is very often just kind of like an innate drive of students, because all up until this point, if they're not doing well, the problem is more effort. Now they find themselves studying for the MCAT and they're not doing well. And so their like response is, I need to crank up the effort, and I need to keep pushing harder and push harder and push harder. And that leads to burnout, and that leads to scores maybe even dropping. And so it's like this positive feedback loop where students are pushing harder and that makes their scores drop more, and they push even harder and it goes even worse. Thinking about things like bodybuilding, right? Like people take rest days because that's important for like the body. That's for marathon running, right? Like it's important for going through there. Like learning at a very high level also needs to be kind of tackled with this idea of understanding your body and understanding how these processes work. And it's not just straight effort, right? And it, like, if you're doing poorly, that doesn't mean that you're lazy, right? Like that's something that like I felt like I was always kind of like feeling like if I'm doing bad, it's because I'm lazy and I'm not trying hard enough. And like, why can't I be as good as these other people who work harder? And that's not necessarily the problem.
Yeah. So there's so much I want to say because I actually just recently took an exam that I had to push back. And it was like one of our national exams, not an in-class exam. And so I had that flexibility. And there were days where I would come out of the library and I would cry because I was like, I don't understand. Like, why is my score going down? Like, I'm reviewing more.
What's wrong with me? Right? Like, yes, yeah,
exactly. And my mom, I love her to pieces. I'd call her and I'd be like, I'm doing more and like my percentage is going down. And I'm like, it's not clicking. And I was like, I don't understand if like my issue is because there's a lot of content on it. And it's a lot of like building. And so it can be hard, like with the MCAT, to know if you're not paying close attention, like where the issue is, right? Because you might think it's content and then you might realize that it's something else. And my trouble was changing so much as I got more pieces. And I called my mom and she reminded me, she was just like, take a step back. And she was like, that when you do more, you do worse. And I was like, hold up. I was like, you don't know what you're talking about. I was like, I got my, my very frustrated med student, right? Or in the case for our listeners, like pre-med, hat on. I was like, you don't understand. And then I paused and because, she just lets me go at it. Yeah, she lets me vent. I love my mama. And I paused and I was like, you're right. I was like, you're right. Because she was just like, think about this exam. And it was because I was burnt out and it was a combination of like still needing more content that I needed to review, but also the way that I was applying what I knew was limited. And it's a constant, this is why I say like, it doesn't end, right? You're constantly having to reinforce those good habits. But like you said, yeah, even like with bodybuilding, like listening to your body, with, studying for the MCAT, with studying for med school exams, it's listening to your body and it's making sure that you actually take care of it, right? Because that's something that is really easy to forget to do. So when you're spending, and I speak from experience, when you're spending long hours in the library, it is easy to forget that you need to eat until your stomach is disrupting everyone else. It's very easy to think that you need to wake up super early, right? It's really easy to make all of these assumptions about what our bodies are physically capable of and then lose out, right, on the opportunity. And with that comes balancing like emotionally where you're at. And that was something that for me was also part of, like, there were a lot of issues that I needed to iron out, which is why I ended up pushing my exam. But I was going into studying so distressed from the day before that what I was learning was not sticking. Like it's that simple. I could sit there and I could read the same thing and I could see that same topic come up over and over again and read the explanations over and over again. But there's kind of that sweet spot of activation, right? There's that sweet spot of, okay, how much stress is okay versus how much is pushing me beyond what I'll actually find useful, that activation sweet spot.
Yeah. To take a minute and kind of step back and go a little bit into some biology here. Stress, like the chronic stress that we're talking about with like studying, like this is different than an acute stressor, right? Like, a bear attack, right? Like that's, your body makes epinephrine and norepinephrine for that adrenaline. But for chronic stress, your body makes cortisol, and cortisol has a bunch of effects on the body, including like it lowers your immune system, right? Which makes you get sick more often. It makes you tired. It messes with hunger, where some people get really hungry and some people forget to eat, right? I am on the other side of that, as I like always during finals season, like in undergrad, I would always, because I pushed off everything and I did sprints, and that's how I dealt with it. But when all of my classes all had their exams in the same week, all of a sudden I'm sprinting in all of these areas. And that was overwhelming and stressful. And every year I get sick, right? I'm starving and just eating nothing but Doritos and like sitting in my room, and I'm tired because cortisol lowers your energy. So it makes you more tired as well. And you add all that together, it makes it harder to learn. Not to mention that just straight up cortisol messes with your hippocampus. There are studies that show that students, like children who are raised in stressful environments, their hippocampus, the main area of the brain for learning and memory, their like stressful scenarios lead to children having hippocampi that are 30% smaller than outside of that. And so like straight up just stress makes your memory worse. And so like you add all of that together and, a really stressful path like the MCAT, like medical school, and all of a sudden students end up in these like positive feedback loops where it's pushing and making everything worse and worse because of the stress going into that. And that's That's a real thing. And as somebody who has found myself in that spiral at times until you hit bottom and all of a sudden you snap because like, I can't handle it, right? That's something that happens sometimes on the MCAT, sometimes in med school for students. And this has a lot to do with just learning to deal and like having strategies that work for this. There's so much to go into with this. I care so much about learning and memory, and cortisol like plays a really big role in this. And I think students underestimate that.
There's a reason why, like we are concerned about in medicine, inflammation, right? There are so many things that it affects. Cortisol increases general inflammation in the body. Like you were saying, that affects our immune system. But there's a reason why one of the first things that a doctor will tell you is, okay, what else do you have going on, right? And that's because there is nothing in our body that's truly ever isolated, right? Mm-hmm. Even the blood-brain barrier has, some things that can pass. But you want to make sure that you're approaching the MCAT with this kind of mentality of, okay, I know that this is going to spread into other areas of my life. Let me make sure I balance each of those areas of my life. And so we talk a little bit about, our physical body, but also just like balancing everything we have on our plate, because very rarely is similar to, one area not really being isolated. Very rarely is a student only studying for the MCAT, meaning they have nothing else going on in their life, right? You have family, you have friends, you have other engagements, you might have school, you might be the head of a family, right? You might have work. There's so much else that's going on. And if you don't provide enough space for each thing, and the adequate amount of space, right, in proportion to other engagements that you have, you're going to have more difficulty studying for the MCAT. You're more likely to burn out in general. And so, for example, if that last week before your MCAT, you also have finals week, probably not a good idea to schedule it that way, right? Mm-hmm. In the first place. But you want to make sure that for those of you that are listening and you're further out from your exam, you don't have it scheduled yet. Those are the kinds of things you want to be thinking about. Like Phil, like you said, your exam date's just kind of sprinting in a bunch of different directions. You don't want your MCAT right after that. You don't want your MCAT immediately before that week either, because that's going to pull you in a very intense, different direction. And so for planning purposes, to avoid burnout, knowing when, how you're going to balance your activities in the, like you said, study plan, we're definitely going to touch on that hopefully soon. But that's something that you're taking into consideration to avoid burnout. But even that last week leading up to exams, and like a lot of students are coming to us, 1-2 weeks out, and they're stressed about this and they're burnt out, building in time that you can spend quality time with other people or spend quality time on things that you enjoy outside of it, and still sit down and look at your to-do list and say, okay, how much time do I actually need to allot to each of these things to create a more balanced last week, a more balanced 2 weeks, to make sure that I don't burn out if I'm not burnt out, and that I can address burnout if I am burnt out.
Yeah, this is also something, and I'm giving a peek behind the curtain a little bit into the Jack Westin realm. I know I've talked about this before, but I grew up in poverty. And so going to college, strapped me. I am still paying my undergrad, student loans, but so I was also working when I was in undergrad, and you add all of this stuff in, and all of a sudden you want to go to med school. And that means that you have to pay for classes to prep for the MCAT. And then you need outfits for interviews and things like that. And all of this stuff, the me applying to med school thing, that cost me an extra $5,000, with flights to interviews and clothing and things like that. And that makes things harder, right? Stress makes life harder for students who are going into this. And so all of a sudden you're kind of at a disadvantage from other students who don't necessarily have all of those stressors. Mm-hmm. And so being able to balance these things. I don't know if I've talked about this very much, but I was a very, very broke student, to the point where I lived in my car for a semester because it was the only place I could afford to be. And so this is one of the reasons why here at Jack Westin, our courses are cheaper than other places. And it's not because they're worse, but we want to try to give an even playing ground and so to remove a little bit of stress from your guys' path that is already stressful enough. That's why when you buy a course for us, like it lasts the life you like until you are in med school. Like you don't have to renew anything. We don't come back and like try to pray and pull more money from you. Like I know some companies, their courses, like you have to repay for it every 4 or 5 or 6 months, depending on that. And so that's something, just like as we were talking about this, all of a sudden I have a lot of feelings coming up about this, about, kind of this pathway. And that's why it's so important, kind of the financial aspect to it. And maybe it's just because that was a big factor in my stress levels. But that's something that definitely factors into this. And so I think that's something to be aware of, that like other stuff outside the MCAT can factor into this. If you have like family commitments or financial issues, or like, a particularly stressful job. Like I know there's a lot of students that work as EMTs and things like that, that can make it harder to be successful in this path because stress makes things more difficult. And like it really will affect with just learning and memory. And so there's a lot of stuff going in with that, but I kind of want to talk, like, rather than just painting doom and gloom, like I want to give students like actionable things that they can do to be healthier and to fix some of these things. I remember my first semester of med school is when I was most having issues kind of adjusting to this. But I remember being very annoyed at like there was several people in my med school class, and I realized all of them were doing the best. Like they were the top like 5, 10 people in the med school class, and they were all super, like they had free time. They did like sporting things. There was one guy who did an Ironman and prepped for an Ironman while he was in med school. There's one person who would travel every weekend to volleyball tournaments. And so he'd like drive like 3 hours to a volleyball tournament in Des Moines. And there were some people that got together and played basketball every single day. And I remember being like, how are they so good that they have time for these things, right? Like it's just something that like I can't even understand it, because I am like going to class and then I'm studying for 12 hours outside of class, which leaves me like 6 hours for sleep. And like, that's it. Like I don't have time to take a 3-hour drive to a volleyball tournament and play volleyball and just like lose an entire day of my studying. And this is something that like, I remember being like, how are they so good? And it wasn't until like a year later, I realized, no, they're not so good that they can do those things. They're so good because they are doing those things. Like those things are actually making them better students. And this is like such a mind flip from undergrad, right? Because remember, in undergrad, you do best by putting in more effort. And if you're doing other stuff, that means you're not putting in effort on that. And it's like, that's kind of the only way you're graded. But on the MCAT and in med school, like all of a sudden, because of the nature of the exams are changing, you need to be able to deal with the tests in a way that is sustainable, right? A way that you can be healthy. I can't do a sprint, like a mental sprint, for 3 months, which is what I was trying to do in med school, because that's what worked in undergrad. And so there's also this kind of like separation that happens in people's brains where they think about like, there's my body and then there's my mind. And those are two separate things and they have nothing to do with each other, right? I can really focus on my mental health or my physical health, but like in reality, like your brain is a part of your body, right? If your body is healthier, your brain's a part of that and going to benefit from it. And so I want to really encourage students not to go into this thing of like, I'm just going to shackle myself to my desk for the next 2 months and then I'll like worry about getting healthy afterwards, right? I'll worry about going to the gym afterwards or going for walks afterwards. And I had a really hard time learning this lesson. And I know I've told this before, but that Christmas of my first year of med school, I remember my mom called me on a Friday and asked me, like, what do you want for Christmas? And I'm like, I don't know, something awesome, like a kayak or a Great Dane puppy or something like that. Because I had just had a roommate who had a Great Dane who moved out, and like I missed the dog because it was a really great dog. And so I don't know, something awesome and fun. And then like that was on Friday night. And then I called my mom Saturday morning. Right. I called her. It was like 10 o'clock. I'm like, listen, I know I said like a puppy, but don't get me a puppy. I can't handle that with med school stuff. I can't take care of this. Lo and behold, somehow in that range from like 5 o'clock Friday night to 10 o'clock Saturday morning, my mom had gotten a puppy for me for Christmas. And so I show up on Christmas and there's my puppy, Millie, short for Milliken, after the discoverer of the electron. And it's really cute Great Dane puppy. And my mom's like, we'd already gotten it and picked it up like in that window. We can keep it here and kind of like take care of it so you don't have to be worried in med school. And then, you can kind of worry when things start to balance out. But I'm like, no, I'll try to make it work. And so I took Millie to med school my second semester. There's a lot of stress with taking care of a dog. But like part of that is I have to take the dog for walks. And so every single day I took a couple of walks, and which meant that I was spending less time studying, but I started doing better. And it's because I was getting exercise. I was going out, I was playing with a puppy, which also relieves stress. And so I really want to emphasize to students that like it's not just something that is nice if you can make room for, but it's something that needs to be a mandatory part of your life. If you want to be successful in this way, you have to take care of the body, which helps the mind.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times we hear like, oh, you have to exercise. And we're like, I don't want to go to the gym, right? Or I don't have a gym near me, or just like, I don't have the motivation for that. Similar to you in my first year, kind of a transition point came with realizing like more is not more, but also the incorporation of exercise. And for me, that did not mean a pet. Unfortunately, I wish I'm very much a cat person, although I have recently realized I also really like dogs. So I think at some point I'll probably have both when I have the sanity for it. And also when I like live in a place that allows for it. But for me, it was, I love social dancing. So when I lived in Chicago, when I was at U Chicago, I picked up swing dancing, and that was something I really enjoyed. I grew up listening to bachata and salsa, and I really enjoyed dancing that. So I was in Chicago, I would go dance that as well. And then I got to Boston, I realized the options were much slimmer. And so I ended up finding this place that has social bachata dancing. And so some nights of the week, it is almost exclusively just bachata dancing. People go, there's like a mini class for beginners beforehand, sometimes for more advanced students. And then people just trade partners the entire night, unless you go with like a group of friends or something and you don't want to switch partners. But I started going twice a week. One of those was on the weekend. And so I would just go dance for a couple of hours, meet new people. I ended up meeting, so I was thinking about this the other day. I ended up meeting a urologist while bachata dancing. And it was like actually pretty fun. We got to see each other a couple of times and dance with each other. Just had the funniest stories like mid dancing. But I would also go Monday nights, and I wouldn't come home until quite late because I had just been dancing, right? And that's it. And I remember like there were a group of us that we would like, I would do a mini lesson beforehand that we would all go together dancing. And that was really fun. And so it was this really great combination of physical movement for hours, once on a weekday, once on a weekend, starting my week off with all that movement, doing something I absolutely loved and have always loved doing, and meeting new people. And I'm an introvert, This may not seem like it. I know you know this, but like, I like my like quiet time, my space. I need to recharge a lot afterwards. And I think because it was something that I loved, that was in and of itself recharging enough that it didn't push me into like needing that full introvert time, but also I was getting some interpersonal, just kind of like time with people. And that allowed me to do better in medical school, among other things. And I think if I had incorporated more movement into studying in undergrad, that would have helped me. That would have helped me with studying for the MCAT, because I was a full-time student, like many of our listeners, as well as, also teaching at the time. And so there always felt like there was something. And like you said, it's hard to remember to take care of yourself in those basic ways when you have so many things that you need to do or that you're stressed about or worried about. And so, I know that a lot of people's gut reaction, because mine is every time someone's like, oh yeah, we need to exercise, it's like, I'm not going to the gym, because the problem is, you can't make me. But once I'm there, I love it. It's a very, so it's the activation energy is a lot higher than once you actually get there. But for me, the activation energy to do like movement that I know I'm going to enjoy, that I can do anywhere, is much lower. And so I think students can learn from both of our experiences, in that finding what that movement looks like for you is going to be different than what it looks like for the next person, but is ultimately what's going to help you when you're studying for the MCAT, when you're in medical school and beyond, and for maintaining, your sanity once you're a practicing physician, because they also have a lot of things that are vying for their time, and they need to remember to take care of themselves as well. And with movement, sleep. I know we've already mentioned it, but like, make sure you're getting enough sleep. Like, one thing that I found really helpful, and I know I've been talking forever, so I will let you talk after this thought, but is actually, so 8 hours is actually, I don't think, ideal, because we sleep in roughly 90-minute cycles, right? And so what can be really helpful is like, set up a time that you're going to fall asleep that day, and then let your body wake up at whatever time it naturally wants to wake up. And if you feel rested, that's how much time you need. And so working backwards and saying, oh, I actually need 9 hours, or actually I do really well on like 7.5, or whatever that number may be, and working backwards to find out how much time you need to sleep, instead of being like, I need 8 hours. It's exactly 8 hours, and account for like the time that it's going to take you to fall asleep. And that's something that a lot of us aren't explained. It is not explained for us to do, but there's so much there. And I just want to that's another action item that students can do, like, figure out how much time you actually need to sleep, account for time to fall asleep, work backwards, and build that into your schedule.
Yeah. I don't know about you, but I also, like, med school was so mentally exhausting
that
I needed sleep more than, like, if I'm sitting and watching Netflix all day, that's not really that mentally exhausting versus like a full day of like dealing with med school stuff that exhausts you. I'm a little bit ashamed as I go through that and think about that, like, first semester of med school. I'm thinking like so much stuff that I did that was not right. I really messed with my sleep, because I'm like, I need more time to study. I need to push harder. And so I even started looking into like things like polyphasic sleep schedules, where I would like sleep for an hour and a half and then get up and study, and then sleep for an hour and a half and then get up and study. And so I would sleep maybe 3 or 4 hours a night, just because I felt like I needed to get more time to study. And like, this is the only thing I can give up in my life right now is sleep. And like, that also, obviously, in hindsight, was not helping this sort of scenario. And so it's really important, right? Like, sleep, like, that also helps you like regulate hormone levels. Like, your hormones change with sleep. And, we've already talked about cortisol a ton. I also want to reiterate, just in case this wasn't clear, but exercise is the best way to lower cortisol. It's the best way to lower the stress hormones in your body. And so if you're super stressed, go for a walk. You don't have to go. Yes, the number one person in my med school class was the guy who ran the Ironman triathlon, but you don't have to do that, right? Like, just going for a walk or going dancing. It's really funny you say that, Azaii, because I also went dancing once a week in my second year of med school, and like, that made things way easier. I'm a big fan of East Coast swing. West Coast, I don't know what to do with my legs, but East Coast, I'm all about that. And so I will stand by that and reiterate that is a good idea. I'll endorse it. That is the official med school dancing or pastime of this podcast is swing dancing. But yeah, so this is big, and I really want to like, just kind of take a moment. I don't want students to fall into the same stuff that I did. I want to save you guys from falling into those traps. Take time, take care of yourself, eat right, be healthy. I was just watching a documentary about about a therapist. And the therapist was talking about he has like multiple stages with all of his patients who are, usually dealing with like grief or trauma or depression. And he says, like, honestly, like 80% of what I do with students or do with patients is like fixing exercise, like just getting out, getting exercise, going for walks. That fixes like 80% of the issues for students or for patients, because like people, when they go through stuff, tend to close in, right? And kind of like go into protect mode. And I will say that like the times when I most like am dealing with stuff, going for a long walk, like it helps me work through that so much better. So I really want to endorse walking, and you can study while you walk if you are really feeling like I can't take time away from studying. Like, get some flashcards, go for a walk, right? Listen to a lecture, listen to a podcast on the topic or something like that. And that is something that listen to our podcast. I'm preaching to the audience here. You guys are listening to podcasts. Just get out and walk while you're doing it. And that will have an effect on your scores if you are not getting any exercise. And so I think that that's big. And that also helps make things sustainable, right? Like, and that's the whole plan here. You need to make sure that the way you are studying now is something that you can keep up for months, that you can keep up for years if need be. And so don't start going down a path of something like, I'm just going to do this for the next couple of weeks and then I'll be okay, because what happens after those 2 weeks? And then there's more stuff coming. And so maybe it seems like that's okay for the MCAT, but I'm telling you now, in med school, it's just going to keep coming. And you need to make sure that you have developed strategies to deal with things in this way that is sustainable, right? We're trying to help you not just, do well on the MCAT, although that is definitely a goal of this podcast, but to also help you guys be more successful med students, be successful physicians. So definitely something to be thinking about.
Yes. And just because I know there are probably people out there like me that they're, and us to some extent, that their attention spans are like, okay, wait, what did we just, what concrete things have we talked about? Like you said, we've talked about exercise, we've talked about eating, we've talked about sleep, we've talked about making sure that you have the balance in terms of other engagements. You actually mentioned a therapist, right? So like if you're someone that has historically struggled with mental health or seeing a therapist right now, talk with them and see, what kinds of things you can incorporate to make sure that you are being kind to yourself, right? But also making sure that your studying and your approach to eventually medical school is sustainable. Something else is what order you study things in. And so part of what allows us to be more have a greater impact on our long-term learning, but also our just like ability to withstand the madness that is the MCAT and our future, is not studying everything all at once. Meaning, yes, like break it apart, but also for the MCAT, don't just sit down and do Chem Phys for 2 weeks and not touch anything else. That's an easy way to get overwhelmed and burn yourself out. Right? Don't sit down. As much as I love cars, do not sit down and exclusively do cars for a month, 2 months out from your test day. That is not a good idea. And so balancing, in addition to balancing your other, the other work that you have to do, balancing what order you approach material, making sure that you're seeing a variety and making sure that you're reinforcing in a variable way is going to be so much better for your mental health, for your studying, for your learning, and for being able to retain. And so being able to do that consistently is going to be important as well.
Yeah, not just for all of those reasons, although those are big enough reasons to do it in and of itself, but also the way that the MCAT tests things and the sciences, they like to mix topics. And so you don't want to have these things compartmentalized in your brain where I study physics for a month and then I throw it in the corner and then I don't look at it again for 3 months. You want to be trying to connect physics to biology, to chemistry, because that's how the MCAT likes to test these things. And so mixing things up is a good way to, like, all those things you said, but also that's how the MCAT tests it. It helps you make those connections better. That being said, I understand the drive for students. Like, I want to do all of physics and I want to cross it out. And there's some power to that like crossing things out, like creates some motivation going through that. And I like that. I like crossing things out. This is also something I'm pretty passionate about within the MCAT. It's really important not just to keep your eyes on the finish line, but also on the progress that you're making, right? Because this happens a lot where there'll be like an MCAT question that requires you to know about like electrostatics and circuits and like nephrology and lipids, right? Those are like 4 different things. And if you, on day 1, you don't know any of those things, so you miss the question. And then you study and you understand electrostatics and nephro and circuits, but you don't really understand lipids, so you still miss that question. Like your score didn't go up any, but you are better off than you were, right? Like you had 3 of the 4 pieces of information instead of 0 of the 4. And so this is also one of the reasons that we'll see students kind of like study for a bit and their scores don't immediately go up. Like it's not always a proportional thing. And that, like focusing on that can lead students to develop this like learned helplessness and lose motivation, where they're like, I've been studying for weeks and my score is not improving. That doesn't mean that you're not learning. That doesn't mean that you are not improving. It's just maybe you haven't got all the pieces that you can kind of put together in that way. And so that's why I think it's really important to keep track of what you've been doing, right? So like write out like all the MCAT topics, right, from the AAMC outline, and then cross those off as you go through them. And I guarantee you that will keep you more motivated if you look at this and see that's how much stuff I've covered, right? I've gotten through this. If you are continually focusing on the scores, what happens, and I talk about this often, like if somebody wants to like bodybuild and they want to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? If that's their main focus, and I just that's all I care about is the end result, then if I go to the gym and I come back and I look in the mirror, I don't look like Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I do that every day this week. And then I do it the next week. And eventually I'm just like, what's the point? I've been working hard and I don't look like Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? Because I have not, like if you're focused on the goal only and not the process, what happens is you continually looking in that mirror and you're continually disappointed. And eventually you say, forget it. This is stupid. I hate it. I'll be a dentist. And we don't want students to do that.
Against dentists.
Yeah. My brother is kind of into dentistry stuff. And so I always like to that is a joke for you, Zach. That's a barb. I'm poking him. And so I do think that that's important, like watching your progress. And so we're not saying don't do that, because I actually think that that's a really critical thing. I have, if anybody goes to the free trial sessions, you might see in the background on my wall, there is a calendar, but every day lights up if you push the date on the calendar. And I use that because like I'm making goals of like getting certain numbers of steps and eating healthy and like taking care of my body, because I tend to forget to do that. I focus too hard on the mental and ignore the body stuff. And I'm working on improving that. And so this calendar helps me look at and see, like watch the progress as the days light up in here. And that keeps me really motivated. You could do a similar thing with just like keeping track of the days and did you study that day, and like cross off those days, and like you look at the calendar and like, look at how much I've studied. I have studied a lot. Like that will keep you motivated and keep you engaged more than just being like, I'm still not at a 515. I'm still not where I want to be at 510. And so I think that's a really important thing as well. So focus on the stuff and the progress that you're making, like watch that, right? Measure that. Don't let the only measurements be your scores coming out of exams, because that's going to be disheartening when you like I said, you learn 3 of the 4 things you need, but you still miss the question. Like you actually significantly improve, but your score didn't change. And I think that is a really important thing to keep track of and be aware of.
Yeah, that's, and what you described is what, I think at the beginning I mentioned that with this most recent exam, my issue with things kept changing. And that's exactly what it was. right? They required multiple pieces of content, plus being able to apply them, plus then taking the next step and figuring out, okay, what would be the next step? And then remembering, what's associated with that next step or whatever it may be. And being purposefully vague because I don't want anyone to like start thinking about med school exams. You don't need to think about that right now. Pass the MCAT, do well on the MCAT. That's what we're here to support you for. And then the added benefit of listening to us is that you will be better prepared for med school. But that was it. Like it felt like a moving target because I couldn't see the progress because there were multiple parts to each of the questions. Same as with the MCAT, right? There's this constant integration. And so that consistency that you were talking about with, studying and being able to cross things off, that's ultimately going to feed into being able to see that progress, right? And I think one other thing that is really important that we keep in mind is being patient with ourselves, even on days where we don't get to cross that day off on the calendar, or when we're sitting down, because like you said, we do need to take stock of our progress, right? And we're saying, okay, so yes, that could be part of it, right? Let me have patience and accountability in each hand. I can be patient with myself. That doesn't mean that I'm going to, I'm not going to expect everything to get better this week, right? But I also want to make sure I hold myself accountable. I want to make sure that I'm not slacking. There's a difference, right, between caring for yourself and finding that balance and slacking. And it's really easy to associate the two and say that they're the same and then make that connection. But also it's really easy to then swing one direction or the other and overcorrect. And so making sure that you have that, accountability for yourself, but also that patience and recognizing small wins are still wins is important. And one of the things that I love saying, I absolutely love it. I don't know at this point, I don't remember if I heard it. I couldn't tell you where I first heard it, but a weakness is a strength you haven't cultivated yet. Right. And I love that saying because it's so powerful, right? We often look at our weaknesses and we're just like, I'm bad. I'm not good at this. I'm that. And then we don't see that possibility of growth and we don't see it as an opportunity. Right. And so when we shift our mindset when we're studying for the MCAT to, okay, this is an opportunity, not just to prepare ourselves for medical school, right, but also that this individual area that I'm struggling with is an opportunity to grow can be really powerful. And just like as another component of our motivation, as another way to remind ourselves to pace ourselves so that we don't get burnt out, but also if we are getting burnt out, it's a good way to step back and say, okay, I can do this. Right. And I can course correct appropriately.
Right. And that's sort of like keeping an eye on progress. I like that quote. I feel like there's one that's kind of similar to that, which I love, which is sucking at something is the first step at being great at something, which is kind of a similar idea of like, oh, no, like being bad at something is just a part of the process, right? And like I said, if somebody's so focused on just the results, then being bad at something feels terrible and that's going to discourage you. But if you're like, no, I didn't understand anything about magnetism and a week later, I understand everything about magnetism, that is an accomplishment, right? Like that is something to be proud of going through that. Now, if you just knew stuff about magnetism and you still know stuff later, that kind of doesn't have that same power to it, right? I really love that opportunity of growth, right? That ability to grow overall, that growth mindset. And I think that is also something that's really big for students to just stay motivated and stay excited about this process. This is something that I think I've brought this up just a couple of times in the podcast, but I have a foster daughter who is going to school, and I can see her getting discouraged at times going through this because she's like, oh, so focused on just the scores, and that's natural just from the way the education system is set up. I'm going to get on my soapbox and shake my fist at the sun. It's like I'm annoyed by some of these things. But that leads to people being less excited to study, right? If you're just being constantly reminded that you're not where you want to be, that feels awful, versus if you're focusing on, oh, here's a thing I learned. How cool is this? Right. And I think that I try to do that a lot in the course with talking about oh, here's this interesting thing, Poiseuille's law. this is why Poiseuille's law kills more Americans than anything else, right? It's interesting, right? Like there's something like once you understand this, you can understand like why blood thinners save lives, right? And like that's a super interesting thing. And so when you start to realize, like, I'm not just memorizing this to memorize this. I'm memorizing this because it's useful, right? All of a sudden you have gained a tool and that keeps you more motivated. That's something I'm doing kind of like sneakily in the course, is hopefully getting people excited to learn, rather than just being like, how do I get my score to this point? We do want to raise your scores, and that is definitely a big focus, but we want to make you enjoy it. So, because if you enjoy the process of studying, you're going to study more and you're going to do even better than if you don't enjoy it. And I think that that is also something important. Like I want my students to walk away saying like, I really enjoyed this process. Not only did I gain a lot and get a lot better, but I liked going through that. And that is not, once again, that's not how the education system is set up. And I think that that's something, there should be changes, and we try to be the change that we want to see. So hopefully that makes sense. And I'm sure some of you guys listening may be in the course, and it's another peek behind the curtain there of some of the things that we're sneakily trying to do. We're trying to trick you into learning where you're having fun and you don't realize you're learning.
Yeah. And kind of one last thought to wrap that up, the free trial sessions. So if anyone hasn't come to those, and you haven't been at a free trial session with Phil, they're really fun. And they're a really great opportunity to learn and kind of get that behind the curtain that you're talking about. And I think one of my favorite things, both in the course and in the free trial session, is those aha moments, or when students are like, oh, wow, I didn't realize that much time had passed. Because I think that's really important to being able to enjoy and avoiding that burnout. And your foster daughter is really, really lucky, really blessed to have you supporting her with that. I recognize that there are some people that will not necessarily have that, and we have support for you here at Jack Westin, because like you said, it's not just about wanting change, it's about actually being a part of the change. And for us, that looks like having the academic advisors who are available to all students for free. It is truly just another way for us to support all students who want, to become physicians, and to make sure that we are providing that equitable access. And I think you also mentioned this before, but I want to make sure I reiterate it. If anyone is on the AMC's fee assistance program, just an extra reason to connect with an academic advisor, because they can help make it so that the course is within reach for you, and that's really important. But like I mentioned, the academic advisors are available to talk with anyone, and they can get you set up with either if you haven't already started the free trial of the course, or like if you want to have an idea of what your application process, not just your MCAT, but your application process can look like. They can be really helpful with all of that. And they are a great resource to provide you support, regardless of what support looks like for you at this point in time.
Yeah. And if you are like Azaii and you have someone to vent to, that's awesome. But you could also just reach out to an academic advisor and vent if you need to, of just like, I'm struggling so hard and this is the process I'm going through and nobody understands. Like it's good to have somebody who understands the process to talk to, because there's a lot of students obviously that go to med school and take the MCAT that don't know any doctors and personally, and that is a very common thing in the world. And so just having the ability to have somebody to talk to, somebody who knows the process. And yes, if you need help, you want to take a look at the course, you want to look at content, you want to go to sessions and office hours and workshops, they can definitely help you with that. If you have questions about tutoring or admissions or things like that, our admissions department has even gotten full ride scholarships for students going to med school. I want to reiterate, hundreds of thousands of dollars we have students who have gotten full ride scholarships because our admissions department has been able to help them with their scholarship applications. And so this doesn't cost anything. Reach out. It's just another one of those things that this is how the system should be. And so we're willing to bite the bullet on this, and we'll pay for it. And so it doesn't cost anything for you guys. But it's something that it's how the system should be.